Yeah, I have a PowerPoint. Oh, and I need a pen. Do you have a second pen? By any chance?
I have one. I think not, actually, because I am...
I
think this is strange with pen.
sorry.
No, sorry, I normally have to.
No, she is. But we can start.
It's red, very serious, critical comments.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paola Tamma. I am the correspondent with the Financial Times here in Brussels, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here at Bruegel to discuss Rearming Europe, how to fund and govern Europe's future defense. We are joined by Rosa Balfour, who is director at Carnegie Europe, and Guntram Wolff, who is professor at ULB and also a fellow and former director at Bruegel. And we are here for because it's a very timing event. We're just back from Warsaw, where finance ministers discuss this very question: how do we fund European defense? Guntram and Jeromin had a very timely contribution to that debate, from which we'll hear from in a minute. And then we will move to a discussion about the broader theme of what are the options, how likely are they to happen, what are the pros and cons. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, both in the room and from people watching online. So please go on Slido, and the hashtag to find the event is #defense, very simple, with SE, so British spelling. There you go. I will give the floor to Guntram for a 50 minutes presentation, and then we jump into it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and present this paper. I will actually give exactly the same PowerPoint that we gave 2 days ago in Warsaw to EU finance ministers. And with the finance ministers, I was very disciplined, so I managed it in 14 minutes. Let's see whether we do that today as well. So it's based on the joint paper with Armin Steinbach, who is a lawyer and professor at HEC in Paris and also a fellow at Bruegel, and Jeromin Zettelmeyer, the director of Bruegel. And it is about the governance and the funding of European rearmament. So what's the issue we have to look at and we need to understand? So the conundrum. So I think the need part is relatively clear. We are in a severe and grave security situation in Europe, and I'm happy to talk about this further, but I think it doesn't need a lot of explanation that the situation is difficult. And part of the answer has to be that Europe needs to rearm. Okay, so we need a large-scale rearmament, and the large-scale rearmament, on the one hand, involves all the sort of mass products and products that are wildly necessary: artillery, tanks, drones, and many other things. But what is, I think, very important is we also need to procure stuff that we call strategic enablers. So what are those strategic enablers? Well, for example, satellite-based intelligence and communication, integrated defense systems such as strategic air defense or strategic lift, the capacity to transport soldiers, troops in the air or maritime. This kind of stuff. And we have a more comprehensive list on this. There's also other sources for this which we reference in the paper. But this kind of stuff at the moment cannot be provided by any European country on this continent. It is provided by the United States in the context of NATO. And for example, General Cavoli, the U.S. Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, in a recent testimony to the U.S. Senate, talked about the importance of the United States providing these kind of things. So I think there is an agenda, a whole agenda here that Europe needs to build capabilities in that space, at least complementary, but ideally also the capabilities to do this stuff on its own. And it's stuff that, as you can imagine, if you think about spy satellites, it doesn't make a lot of sense to for every single European country to build its own spy satellite network and send it into space, and therefore then have its own satellite-based intelligence. So there is a case here to do this basically at the European level. And we'll talk about this further. Okay, so what are the constraints? I mean, the first constraint is that our our defense industry is fragmented and overstretched. So we have basically a pretty strong home bias in military procurement. 2/3 of the procurement in the bigger countries is basically procurement from domestic producers or from joint ventures. The second point here is that as a result, because we are all relatively small countries, even the country I know best, Germany, is a relatively small country. That means that the companies and the scale of weapon productions is actually pretty small. And so if you look at, and I'm just giving you one example here, tank production, I mean, tanks, Russia produces at the moment more than 1,500 tanks per year. So that's the number we get in Russia. Germany, the biggest European industrial economy, procured since 2022 123 tanks to be delivered by the year 2030. Okay, so we are talking here of production numbers, annual production numbers of 10, something a bit more than 10. So there's really a scale issue, and we need to think about how to solve the scale issue in this fragmented market. And the third, I think, important constraint is that several technologies are missing. So we have strengths in certain types of technologies, as the European arms industry has these strengths, but in others we don't. And that includes, I mean, here are two examples: 5th generation fighter jets, HIMARS style rocket artillery system, and similar. Well, and then of course the overall second big constraint is that not all countries have similar fiscal space. So when we talk about sort of European or joint initiatives, it's not always obvious how to do that, because some countries might be less or more willing and capable of contributing. Okay, so what are the implications? Well, in the face of these constraints, the rearmament efforts that we are now undertaking, and we have many of European countries are now increasing their defense spending, may well end up strongly in prices, right? I mean, so if you expand demand, but your defense industry is very fragmented and very small and has monopoly power, right? I mean, or strong market power. Well, I mean, an expansion of demand, that's economics 101, I mean, essentially leads to an increase in the markups. And of course, that makes rearmament very, very expensive and unaffordable. Okay, and as a result, therefore, the resources that are spent might not be enough. Okay, so what's the solution? I mean, the solution in principle, that's essentially economics 101, is straightforward. The first thing you want to do is you want to create a common market for defense products, a European defense market. That has two advantages. I mean, first of all, it increases competition among the big established players that are that exist. So Dassault, Leonardo, and Rheinmetall. I mean, they would have all to compete, right, in an integrated market, and not only operate out of quite fragmented markets. But I think equally importantly, you would facilitate new entry, right? I mean, we have looked a bit at sort of new entry, new defense companies. There's lots of new defense companies being founded as we speak, and, being very small, 10, 20, 30 employees wanting to enter this market because you can make a lot of money in this market. Well, and of course, the question is, do these companies grow in segmented small national markets, or do they grow into a European integrated market, right, where they get the scale and therefore then the cost structure that ultimately is needed. So European market creation, I think, is very important. The second point is the procurement side. So even if there is market power and it's very difficult to have more competition, well, if you do joint procurement, you have actually market power on the buyer side. So basically some sort of a monopsony, if you wish, that would allow you to compress markups in this space. And of course, the joint procurement could also help you really create the scale, right? Because one has to agree on certain standards, etc. And as a result, ideally, the unit costs would fall substantially. And this is what we see on the right in this chart. I mean, it's indicative of the potential that when you increase the numbers that you produce, you actually bring down the costs per unit. We have a full discussion in the paper of this. Where, I mean, in the management literature, basically the assessment is if you double your production, your cost per unit might go down between 10 and 20%. Now we are talking here of easily doubling, if not times 10 for some products. So you can really bring down costs very substantially. But for that, you need to sort of procure together. And thirdly, of course, there are these European strategic enablers. And you could, of course, in principle, envisage to own them and to fund them jointly together. And that would allow to spread the fiscal burden. So the satellites, not everybody has to buy the satellites. You buy them together. The cost per satellite per country is going to be lower. So the solution in principle is easy. Now in practice is more difficult. Of course, but what's the point here? I mean, the point here is that, of course, we have lots of European initiatives, European Defense Agency, PESCO, SAFE, EDA and PESCO. We have in the paper a full discussion how to use the existing instruments and expand them. And we show that you can actually go quite a step forward with that. And can really advance production quite a bit. However, if you really think that this is going to solve it, I mean, there are some very, very big constraints in the current built into the current framework. What are those 4 constraints? Well, first of all, we need strong enforceable commitment devices to bring down the costs of procurement and take away the home bias. And for that, you need to lead against national traditions, switching costs, the capture of procurement agencies by national contractors, and so on and so forth. And why is that difficult and in the current framework? Well, basically because we have in the EU treaties Article 346 that rules out such a commitment device that would allow you to overcome these pressures. Why? Well, basically because the 346 is a national security exception from the single market. So the result is that the EU treaties make any sort of commitment device based on EU law actually subject to legal challenge in the Court of Justice according to Article 346, primary law. The third issue is that the fiscal benefits of the existing mechanisms and the ones that are proposed, so for example the SAFE mechanism or the SURE-type facility, are relatively small. So the Commission talks in its Rearm Europe plan about the 800 billion, of which 150 would be lending by the EU to member states. Well, basically the maximum you can achieve with that is 150 billion times 45 basis points, which is the current spread between Italy and the EU funding. And so that's if all were given to Italy, that would be 0.02% of Italian GDP. So very small fiscal advantage, actually. And last but not least, any EU solution, while you can on a project level include non-EU countries in it, you cannot have the UK or other players really in the governance on an equal footing from the beginning in the mechanism. So if the strategic decision is to include the UK, well, then actually the pure EU instruments are difficult. Okay, so what are we proposing? We are proposing, therefore, to go one step further than expanding and building on the existing mechanism. We are proposing to create a European defense mechanism. There's an analogy here to the ESM. How would it look like? Well, it would include European democracies that want to participate in it. So that allows non-EU countries to join, but it also allows some EU countries that don't want to join not to join, right? I mean, so some countries have constitutional constraints, etc. The second, what is the obligations, the membership obligations? Well, first of all, you want to create the single market with this thing, right? So you basically say no discrimination against defense industry from other member countries if you're part of that club. In some pre-specified areas, you do joint procurement. And last but not least, of course, when you're a member, you have to pay for the stuff that is jointly procured. Governance, well, I mean, we haven't really discussed that in the paper a lot, but essentially you have some sort of a paid-in capital subscription, and then you have votes in relation to the paid-in capital subscription. How do we operate? Well, there's a planning of joint procurement operations and strategic enablers is part of what you have to do. Ownership of strategic enablers could be in the hands of the EDM. And the advantage is if you have the ownership in the EDM, that's for the fiscal wonks, you can actually take it off the balance sheet of the member states. So it stays on the balance sheet of the EDM and not on the balance sheet of the member states. You fund through bond issuance especially for these strategic enablers, and the payments from the members comes in when the material is procured. That's for the large procurements, joint procurements, as well as a service charge for the use of the strategic enablers. Lastly, you could also use this thing, of course, to support frontline countries. And in the paper, we have a chart that shows that essentially Western Europe spends much less on defense than Eastern Europe, let's put it this way. And, you know, there's arguably some free riding on the defense provided by Central and Eastern Europe by Western and Southern Europe. And so with this mechanism, you could, in principle, separate a bit the funding from the distribution. Okay, so let's conclude. I think we need to solve three problems. One is the competition and entry. One is the scale in procurement. One is the funding and governance of strategic enablers. That is unlikely to be solved at the EU level. Article 346, unanimity decisions and non-EU democracies that with a large defense sector could not be part of a purely EU single market for defense. An EDM based on an intergovernmental treaty can solve these problems because it can create a legal basis for defense single market and joint procurement. It is a coalition of the willing, so veto players can be left out. It can include non-EU countries, and it can own collective defense assets and the debt used to finance them. So that's, I would say, the description of the proposal. On the politics and the difficulties to getting there, I guess we can discuss that in the panel. Thank you.
There. Thanks for the timekeeping too. Indeed, I mean, there is a trend which is an awareness that more needs to be done on defense. We have seen an increase in national defense spending, 22 members of NATO reaching 2% last year for the first time, compared to only 10 years ago. We have seen Germany take quite a seismic decision in terms of its own defense funding, changing its debt rules. We will see probably a lot of countries apply for the national escape clause, which the Commission has proposed to use to exempt defense from further steps under the process of excessive deficit procedure and so on. So kind of a card out of jail if you spend on defense. And then obviously there's the European level funding. There's been the 150 SAFE proposal, but as you said, the limits of that are quite limited, and also compared to the needs, what has been estimated, it's just a fraction of it. And then there's a plethora of ideas. There's obviously Eurobombs, which pop their head back up a lot of the time, but for political constraints, this is not going to be. I'll wage my my next salary that's not going to happen, at least in the very time soon. There would need something as big as COVID to happen, whether that's Putin testing Article 5 or something else. Let's see. There's then many different ideas on the theme of an SPV or joint fund, of which you've built. We have seen iterations coming from the polls, from the Rearmament Bank proposed by former British generals. We have seen a proposal by the UK, which was quite interesting politically, and obviously your paper, which kind of, I think, really brings it a few steps further than everything else in terms of both the advantages and the theoretical thinking behind it. But probably because it is so ambitious, it is also very politically controversial, I think. But first of all, Rosa, I wanted to ask you, I've been here long enough that when these moments and this Zeitenwende happen, we're all thinking that this is it, this is the moment, but then sometimes European politics is taken by a different storm and we rapidly forget. So this increased awareness of the need to ramp up defense funding. Do you think it is a trend or a spurt?
Thank you very much, Paola, and thank you for the invitation. That's a good question. I'm going to address it immediately and then perhaps come back to it at the end of, I've got a few points that I'd like to make. So I'm one of those people who did not think that the Next Generation Recovery Plan was a Hamiltonian moment, although I thought it was a big step. And I've been, I have been one of those who's been saying, hang on a minute, this is not, the EU is not suddenly going to be changing. But actually, I think this time it is different. And it's different because of the United States. If the United States either pulls out of NATO in one form or another, if it abandons NATO and Europe, or if it's actively disruptive towards Europe, Europe has a problem. And all the signs coming from Washington are negative. There is open hostility towards the European Union, and there is pretty much indifference towards Europe as a continent. And I think that this reality is sinking in, but I think it will take a little bit longer to sink in further, and I'm going to come back to this. Because first I'd just like to make perhaps a few sort of political and geopolitical points within which I think all these debates about how to go about defence and how to fund it and how to govern it ought to be placed. So a bit of sort of context. My first point really is, if we look at the security situation in Europe today, we need to look at it in a two-pronged way. The first is that Ukraine is actually Europe's best defense at the moment. Supporting Ukraine militarily is the best thing that Europeans can do to protect their own security. And I suspect that many are wondering, whether had the West been a bit more incisive and a bit more ambitious in military support over the past 18 months, whether we would be where we are now, because Russia is not undefeatable, okay? So I think that's the first point. And then the second point is that we have this imperative of focusing on the degree to which Europe can autonomously take care of its own security, its own territorial defense, and its own deterrence. And I think the fact that Ursula von der Leyen said that a few weeks ago, using the word deterrence, that has not happened before, okay? So that is an indication of how things have changed and how the thinking has changed, certainly in the European Union institutions and in several member states, but perhaps not in all. So in light of this, let me say a few words about Ukraine, about the situation with respect to Ukraine. There is a coalition of the willing that is stepping up, that stepped up immediately after Trump's basically phone call with Putin where, it showed that it shared a worldview with the Kremlin. And this coalition of the willing, as we all know, is not only, in fact, there are a few member states in it, and there is the UK. So it's a non-EU coalition of the willing. I think the way in which they have been operating has been to be very results-oriented, to thinking about what practical steps can this coalition of the willing provide in case of a ceasefire agreement, which hasn't actually come about, and we don't know what's really going to happen there. And I think some of the uncertainties around the shape of the practical deployment of, be it a reassurance mission, or be it, some call it peacekeeping mission. I don't think that's an adequate terminology, but security guarantees for Ukraine, right? That is what needs to be, that needs to be the focus. We don't know the shape because we don't know whether there will be a ceasefire. But I think the simple fact of this happening is actually quite important. And I think we need to keep this in mind because I think it is pertinent. So let me just say the three ways in which this is important in my view. The first is that we have a situation in which actually defense procurement is being driven by Ukraine, by the needs of Ukraine. I think Zelensky's shopping list has been the best thing for European defense because it has forced Europeans to think about what is it that is actually needed rather than spending for the sake of spending, for the sake of reaching targets. So that is probably, we should take that as a way to overcome the fragmentation that exists in the defense sector and to overcome the fragmentation in procurement. The second point is precisely the fact that it brings in the UK, the United Kingdom. Security and defence in this continent has always been driven by a Franco-British understanding. So I think it's wishful thinking to imagine that we can do it without the UK. There will be a UK-EU summit next month, in 19th of May. There is a certain amount of hope that there will be some kind of agreement signed that will include security and defence, and this sets the tone for the defence debate that is taking place within the European Union. And I think also this is much more long term. The inclusion of the UK, the fact that this is done through the coalition of the willing, actually announces a future debate, which we ought to start thinking about, on the future security architecture of Europe without Russia, okay? So I think, again, the fact that this coalition of the willing exists, even if it's not in EU format, is actually a positive thing for security on the European continent. Future of defence. Guntram mentioned, there are several initiatives out there. There are several new ideas, but there are also several tools. There's been a lot of activity at the EU level recently. So what I'd like to do is just focus, what are the political criteria that we need from these various initiatives, and which initiative or idea will satisfy the greater number of political criteria, and therefore perhaps be, we can have a sort of, a spectrum of the more ambitious and the less ambitious, but at least make sure that these political criteria are addressed. I mean, the first is the obvious one, and that is efficiency and coordination and cooperation. I mean, it's not as if, as you mentioned, Paola, the target of reaching the 2% target, in many countries it has been reached over the past decade, but does that make European defence more coordinated and based on cooperation? That still is a big question, right? The second point that is increasingly necessary to look at is how to circumvent vetoes, because of the problems that Europeans are having with respect to Ukraine and with respect to defence. Hungary is the elephant in the room, but there are also other, possibilities of veto. Thirdly, in light of what I said before about the coalition of the willing, the need to bring in partners, and that's something that the EDM, the European Defence Mechanism, looks at. The ability to mobilise national funding, private funding, EU funding, and to create scale. That seems to be another political precondition. And then something, Guntram, that you haven't talked about, NATO-EU coordination and cooperation. How do we use NATO structures? How do we use NATO resources? And how do Europeans adapt? I mean, can we build a European pillar in NATO? That's where the big military resources actually are. I still have a couple of questions for you, Guntram, and my question would be, how, in what ways, you've talked about the market mechanisms, but you know, there is, I think, a strong need to overcome fragmentation at different levels, and one is the political level. So how does this initiative encourage political cohesion? And also, from perhaps the more market point of view, how does it overcome the gaps between large European companies, which I understand are small on a global scale, but they're large at a European level, and small and medium-sized enterprises? And there are a lot of startups in this area. Many of them are actually in Ukraine, and they are driving the defense debate in terms of, you know, what is needed for 21st century warfare. Oh gosh, I'm going to try. I've got 3 more points. I'll try to go through them really quickly. Yeah, I'll try to be quick here. So I still think that, and sorry, this is perhaps because that's my background, we need to, when we talk about defense, we need to think about what for, right? We need to have a shared threat assessment, and I'm not entirely sure that member states are actually there. You need to have a threat assessment. You need to have, what do we need in order to address those threats, and then what do we, what do we need to buy, and then how do we buy it? So I think that seems to me the order of questions. Now, we don't have time. I mean, this is urgent. This needs to be, all of this ought to have been ready already, right? So we don't have time. But I do think we need to continue talking about what is this actually for. And in this context, I'd like to just throw out the fact that in October, the Commission published a report that was commissioned to former Finnish President Niinistö. We have a lot to learn from the Finns. And that report was really focused on resilience. It was focused on preparedness. It was focused on societies. And that is very much the sort of Nordic model of security. And if the debate shifts in a much more sort of defense and military oriented way, perhaps we're missing a component of what is needed in thinking about European security. And the reason I say this is because, this is my 4th point, and I've still got one after that, is we need to make sure that we have political consensus and legitimacy. Because, you know, the narrative now is on, you know, the urgency of the moment, the uncertainties coming from Washington, the fact that Putin bombed northern Ukraine last night, or was it the night before? I flew back in from India, so my sense of time is completely warped. We need, you know, but at some point, Putin might pretend that he's agreeing to some peace initiative because he wants to make Trump happy. How do we sell to our publics the fact that this is a multi-annual effort in a continent which stopped spending on defense after the end of the Cold War? How do we justify that? It's very important that we maintain political legitimacy of these efforts, and in order to do that, I think we need to have an open debate about what the goals are and why are we needing to make these investments. Some countries have already chosen cuts in order to finance defense. Cuts are never a good thing. There will be costs at different levels. Okay, all right, okay. So, so there will be costs, and you know there are risks of securitization. There are costs on Europe's soft power. You know, there's a whole range of issues there that need to be discussed. Final point on the transatlantic relationship, and this is where I am a little bit concerned because we have this great moment of recognition that Europe needs to focus on its own security, and it needs to do so in autonomy from the United States. But I think the strength of transatlanticism remains, and there's a lot of nostalgia. and for the transatlantic relationship and the easy days, right? And so, in 6 months' time or in 1 year's time, will that momentum that we see today, will it be kept up, or will transatlantic nostalgia kick back in and dilute efforts or slow down those efforts to build Europe's resilience and security?
Thank you very much, Guntram. I'm going to come to you and I'll let you address some of the points that Rosa raised. But actually, she touched upon something which I think it's very, very key. The political acceptance, both among the finance ministers and their principals, the leaders, but also the societal acceptance of all of this. So perhaps, you can give us a sense. When I read your paper and we talked about this, I thought, well, excellent if you can pull it off, but I am quite not an optimist as a journalist, so I tend to believe that things are not that possible or not that likely. And the reactions, or at least some of the reactions, were some very positive from your room, but you know more than me, and you can tell the room what you want. Some were quite standoffish, because they go to touch the very core of what is a nation state, which is their ability to defend. And to bring that at a European level is a big ask. I think a very smart ask, but a very big ask in political capital terms. And then also, if you can address, so what's the process, what's the likelihood? People talk about the NATO summit in July as a moment where we will see really whether it is, a moment for, we'll go back to Uncle Sam and please keep us under your umbrella, or we'll actually be serious about taking it on our own. And then if you can also spend a couple of minutes talking about the financing of all of this, even though quite innovative, and from national guarantees, you could leverage them on capital markets, keep it at European level, create that fiscal space for countries not to have to choose between welfare and defense, between foreign aid and defense, which are always negative trade-offs. So if you do not have that, you will have to do trade-offs. And how do you bring the society along? We've seen that with the Green Deal, amazing project, but perhaps the societal feasibility of that was not really thought through. Thank you.
Wow, wonderful! Thank you so much for the both great comments and great questions. So let me start with yours, Paola. I mean, the first point on sort of the issue of national sovereignty, right? I mean, of course, we are touching areas, core areas of national sovereignty. We are touching upon them, and Article 346 in the EU treaties is there for a reason. It's there because basically member states think this is a core area of national sovereignty. Now, the key question, of course, is, from my perspective, not so much whether you give up national sovereignty, but whether we actually regain sovereignty that at the moment resides in the White House. Because when you look at the capabilities that are missing, I mean, these capabilities are not under the control of any European country. Now, then you have different assessments on the transatlantic relationship, and each of us probably has a different view on where this will go, etc., etc. And I don't think, I mean, I can have my own political view on this, but I mean, I think the fact that we have questions marks on this is, in a sense, the start of the motivation, in particular for the kind of stuff that at the moment is only provided in the context of NATO by the United States. Okay, so if you don't think that's an issue, then significant parts of what we describe are not necessary anymore, because we can just continue to rely on NATO and the US. And frankly speaking, my experience, having spent 2 years in Berlin with talking with a lot of people from more the security community, I mean, for them, NATO and US is so hardwired in the thinking that it's very difficult for them to actually move the next step and sort of dare think about a world in which frankly speaking, the US is not just not going to save our back always, right? And so I think that's basically the world we are in, and I think that's why I wouldn't say no. It's not about giving up national sovereignty. It's about regaining some sovereignty from the White House. The second is the relation with NATO, between NATO and this EDM. So I mean you can conceive this European defense mechanism as a narrow mechanism, which essentially does funding and procurement, but based on procurement lists that it gets from somewhere. Now that somewhere can be NATO, that can be national defense ministries, that can be a combination of the two. So that's one way of sort of thinking about the relation with NATO. Of course, if you think that NATO becomes more difficult as an organization, because let's acknowledge that NATO operates under unanimity. The North Atlantic Council is unanimity driven, and there's one big player that calls the shots. And so it might be difficult to get from NATO the kind of list that one needs to procure, because that list might actually not be given by NATO, right? So in that case, somebody else has to do that list. Now, it's not for me as an economist to think about this list. I only gave the example with the spy satellites, whether it's spy satellites or what exactly it is. Someone has to draw up that list, and it could, of course, in principle, also be such a mechanism, right? I mean, that mechanism could hire the people that it needed to draw up such a list. Okay, so that's the second point that I wanted to react to. Then there is, I would say, the Ukraine. You mentioned Ukraine quite prominently, and I mean, I agree with you. I mean, Ukraine is a very, very interesting country to look at from a variety of reasons. One reason certainly is also the arms industry itself. So Ukraine is now in some weapon systems the leader globally, probably in terms of quantity and quality, including, for example, for drones. So we have in the paper a full paragraph in which we discuss to what extent Ukraine could and should be part of such a mechanism. I think eventually it should be part of that mechanism. In the short term, I guess it will be difficult because what is produced in Ukraine needs to be used in Ukraine by the Ukrainians to fend off the Russians. So it would create distortions if they became part of a single market for defense products from the beginning, because we might buy basically in competition to the Ukrainian arms forces. Exactly. So that's the relation with Ukraine. But I very much agree that Ukraine has helped us focus our thinking. So then there was a point on the likelihood of all of this. I mean, that's of course a complicated question. I mean, I would say there is political openness, certainly in the north and in the east of Europe, to contemplate this and to work further on it. I think Commissioner Dombrovskis was also, I think, publicly saying, if I remember correctly, that Commission is open to think about this, and so I think there's also some support from the institutions. Let's put it this way. Now, at some level, I think this will be not a decision of the finance ministers, and I think there I'm with you. I mean, the finance ministers, I think they need to be the lobbyists for this. Why? Well, basically because that's the way they can really save a lot of money, right? I mean, we have a big rearmament effort in front of us. If we do this rearmament effort in fragmented small markets, it's going to be very expensive, yeah? I mean, very expensive. And so this is a way, from a finance perspective and a taxpayers and a citizen's perspective, a way of really bringing down the costs. But you are right, it presupposes, of course, some level of trust, of political agreement that is not going to be just driven by the finance ministers. I mean, certainly I think prime ministers and chancellors, etc., will be involved in any initiative in that direction. And so let me not speculate on how the future German government will think about this. My sense is that Friedrich Merz has pretty strong European instincts when it comes to this at the moment. But how then he will exactly and his government will think about this further, I think is a bit difficult to say. And of course, the French situation is also not easy. Let's put it this way at the government political level. So we will have to see how this evolves. But again, I think great questions, and in particular, I think this point of including the UK, including Norway, but also including the UK, I think is historically, absolutely strategically, is absolutely important. I mean, it's important for the defense industry, and it is important from a geostrategic point of view. I mean, if there is unity between Germany, France, and the UK and Poland on these issues, I mean, I think we have a possibility to get out of this and basically survive as a free continent. If we are divided among our key countries, I mean, then decision making, as Vladimir Zelensky also said at the Munich conference, then basically we choose Moscow, and he said that very explicitly, and I think he's right.
Thanks for that. I have perhaps one quick question to each of you, and then I will open the floor. I wanted to ask you, well, one of the questions actually touches upon it. One issue is trust. We have probably east to west a gradient of how willing and ready we are, and how strongly do we perceive the trust coming from Russia, and therefore the counter threat of perhaps the US will not be there, and with the recent news of withdrawal of intelligence from Ukraine, but also a reshuffling of troops around Europe. I think this is very much perceived and concrete when you travel from Helsinki down to Kiev, whereas from where I'm from, Italy and Portugal and Spain, the question is very different. And you see that in the financing discussion too, where you have laggards in defense spending who are also looking for all sorts of non-national funding, but more for a knowledge as a fig leaf to cover the fact that they haven't spent a lot. How do you build the trust? And how, like in very concrete terms, you have addressed partly in the presentation, you could have in the EDM, whether it's EDM or something similar, a mechanism which enables Easterners to say, okay, they got the message, we can have this joint ownership at European level because we know that this will serve us in the moment of need. And then you can have Westerners or others saying, okay, well, this is not free riding, this helps us too, this is also defense. How do you build that trust in very concrete terms? If I can put that to Guntram, but also Rosa, if you want to add anything.
I mean, very quickly on the satellites. I mean, I think the first point is we have a precedent that is the GPS system Galileo. This is a European system. It is owned by the European Union. It's not owned by member states. It's owned by the European Union. And it's controlled by two control centers, one in Germany and one in Italy. And I think for a network of spy satellites, I mean, I could see exactly a similar mechanism where it's there are 2 or 3 control centers basically in 2 different countries. So that gives a little bit of robustness to the whole thing. And then there is, of course, more complicated than with the GPS. You have to take political decisions. Who gets what kind of information, right? And so that would have to be the members of that mechanism would have to have a governance mechanism around this where they decide on how to share intelligence and with whom to share. But again, saying that this is encroaching on national sovereignty, I think is just the wrong way of framing it. When President Trump decided to cut off the Ukrainians from intelligence, Ukraine lost essentially Kursk region as a result, and no European country had an alternative to provide to Ukraine, and so I think there clearly it's about getting that kind of decision-making power in the body like an EDM, where there would be qualified majority voting or perhaps 2/3 majority voting on such sensitive issues, right? But I mean, at least it would be a European decision.
So QMV is quite key. I'd be keen to open the floor for questions. Can you please be brief and state who the question is to? There will be a roving mic. The gentleman in the first row.
Bertrand de Cordoue from the Institut Jacques Delors. First thing, I think this is a very interesting piece you produced. So thank you for that. It's plenty of interesting data and interesting suggestions and ideas. I would even say it's refreshing because you are using a language which is not the common language of defense experts. So it will stimulate defense experts to think maybe differently and so on. Having said that, I am a bit concerned that you in your analysis you are ignoring or somewhat downsizing what already exists at the EU level. Strategic enablers, for instance, we cannot ignore that we have powerful European assets in strategic lift, in space observation, space telecommunication. So therefore, we are not starting from nothing, and we are not 100% dependent upon the US on this kind of strategic enablers.
Your question, please.
Secondly, joint procurement. This is the cornerstone of the recent proposal from the Commission, the SAFE instrument, which is built to help incentivize joint procurement. So there is already an initiative existing at EU level on that. Then you spoke about common ownership. This doesn't really exist so far, but we already have common use. There is an organization called EATC based in Eindhoven, which is sharing the military air transport capacities of several member states. So this is to say that there are a number of already existing assets and building blocks. And this leads me to my question, which is there another reason than having the UK on board for this EDM mechanism? I don't say that having UK on board is not important, but is there for you another reason that having the UK on board to create a separate instrument like the EDM, which is actually different from what happened with your example of the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, where, of course, this is within the EU organization?
So very quickly, I mean, at the SAFE point, we looked at it in detail, and indeed, SAFE foresees a move towards joint procurement and more standards. The problem why we think SAFE in the end will not work is that the incentive to do this under SAFE is super small. So the fiscal incentive is very small, and therefore it probably won't fly, while our mechanism offers more significant benefits. And that's why we think this mechanism goes further than SAFE. On the UK, so beyond the UK issue, the other big advantage is that you can build in an intergovernmental treaty from the beginning a non-discrimination clause, which in any European mechanism you can build in. So you can have a sort of, in the European Defence Agency, you could say, oh, we procure without discrimination across different countries. But whenever a member state wanted to challenge that, it could just go to the European Court of Justice and based on Article 346 challenge it. And so that's basically primary law beats secondary law. While in an intergovernmental mechanism, you can go a bit further by basically making it hardwired into the intergovernmental treaty. So it is then a legal question how far you think that will carry over and how strong that will be. But I think that's basically, I would say, the key 2 points is the UK and other non-EU countries, which I think we should keep very close, plus the stronger legal enforceability through something outside of 346.
Rosa, do you want to add anything on this? You're okay? Okay. I'm going to maybe jump on a question that I had on Slido and also add my bit to it. We talked about the sovereignty and how you think this is not a stripping away, rather a regaining from the US. But when it comes to the ban on national preference in procurement, which is a key thing of what you're suggesting, to me, I see it's very difficult for countries to be able to let go of that. Whereas I see for the strategic enablers the huge benefit. I mean, we just don't have them and can't afford them as any one single country. The idea that Italy or France, for the matters, or others would open up their markets and lose those key contracts, and and you wrote it, that there's state capture in Ministry of Defense from the national champions. They've been there for long enough. There's so much revolving doors, and they know exactly who to go to talk to. So, I mean, how do you suggest that happens? Yeah, linking to an anonymous question of, is it likely that France will participate in EDM, considering its strong defense sector and the state's role in it? Change France for anyone else?
Look, political predictions are always very difficult, and I think I certainly would say we live in very, very extraordinary times, and so in these times also the political system sometimes moves much more than one thinks. Now, my main political economy argument why I think this actually has a chance is that we are in a situation where the overall market size is growing tremendously, right? I mean, yes, you might lose some of your national contracts if you give up on this national preference, but you get a whole market, a European market, at a moment of big growth. And so to think and to worry about any of our European defense companies at the moment, I think is really not needed. I mean, they are all making, you see the stock markets, they are making a lot of money, and they will all see their employment increase very substantially in the coming years. So if there is a moment where the political economy is in favor of doing this, it's now. I mean, at a moment when there's no growth in the market, it's much more complicated, because then it becomes a zero-sum game, basically. But now it's a very positive sum game, and at that moment, not to introduce an element of competition means really that taxpayers will have to really overpay for defense, and I think that will be ultimately politically very, very difficult. So I think there is a chance, also from a political economy point of view.
Are these closing remarks? Kind of.
I think that, no, there's a couple more questions.
All right, okay. Well,
so let's take maybe on the second row there, and then the gentleman. We take them together. Please say who you're addressing in the question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Yazan. I'm a diplomat at the mission of Syria to the EU. My question is about the link of this EDM with the foreign policy. It has two aspects. First, can the EU, as the European External Action Service, for example, go and negotiate depending on the defense capabilities that the EDM will have, not the European Union? How will that help the foreign policy of the EU? And the second question is that maybe now there is consensus about Ukraine, but there are other issues related to defense, like the issues in the Red Sea, like the fight on terrorism. Will this EDM also help in that regard? Doesn't that need some kind of common foreign policy in the EDM? And how will that be addressed? This is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we want to collect the second question from gentleman?
Thanks a lot. I'm Stefano Spinaci from the European Parliament. So my question is not a lot about the hardware, but it's about the software. So the men, the army, the men and the women. Do we have any idea of how the future European army should be built up? So should be a professional army, should be on voluntary basis. We have different systems in different countries. And also we will be able to create a system like maybe United States, where you can work in the army till 35, 40, and then you have some future chance to work in the private sector, because this is a big subject. Otherwise we will have people arriving at 40 and looking for another job, and they will not find, and we cannot pay pensions at 40.
Thank you. Very quickly, I'd say Rosa first.
Okay. Actually, these two maybe, I'll address these briefly. we're not talking about a European army. I've always thought the European army was a myth. That's not really what it is about. This is really about trying to better coordinate national defence expenditure and systems so that they can work together when needed. So I would say I think it's a bit misleading actually that this idea, when Juncker mentioned it in 2012 or so, I've always thought it was a bit misleading because that's not really what it's about. The foreign policy dimension, that's interesting that you asked that question. I've just come back from India. India has suddenly discovered the European Union. The EU and India want to conclude a free trade agreement by the end of the year. It's been negotiated for over 20 years, right? So it's really ambitious. And it will include, the idea is to include some defence cooperation in the FTA. And these provisions already exist. I mean, Borrell organised 2 Schuman Forum conferences here in Brussels, one last year and one the year before. I don't know if there's going to be one this year, which brought the MODs of countries all around the world. These mechanisms exist. It's also in the European Peace Facility. So there is a foreign policy component. I think the question so far, if you come from outside, is how interesting is it to work with the European Union as opposed to France, Germany, Czech Republic, etc., on defence. And so if the EU manages to support European defence efforts, then it can become interesting also for third countries. So I would frame it in those terms. But the mechanisms already exist. And in fact, I mean, a lot of, and you review in your paper, you review the existing mechanisms. I think the question is really, from my perspective, has been, common security and defence policy has existed since 1999, and it has not produced what it was intended to produce. So what is it? What do we need in order to strengthen the European component of security and defence?
Thank you. And Guntram, final words? You think we're good? I think we can take it bilaterally outside if anybody has more questions for the author and for Rosa. So thanks a lot for being here.